Hey everybody, welcome to Popular Culture. Today I want to talk to you about a show that you've probably never watched, but an idea that stemmed from that show that definitely affects you and everyone else and the way that we think about pop culture. So let's get to it. So in the 1980s, there was this very popular show that lots of people were watching around the world that took place in Dallas, and it was called Dallas. And a book came from that by an author who wrote about the ideology of television, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So I just want to say, if you've been reading the article, the excerpt from the book, or if you've been trying to figure out some of these things, it doesn't matter. Dallas doesn't matter. I mean, it's nice if you've seen it and you understand it based on what's actually in the show, but I just want you to remember that what we are discussing has nothing really to do with the show Dallas, but all of these questions that came that were applied to Dallas, but now have been applied to many other things. So, getting to that, just as a super quick summary, I've never really watched it myself. I've seen clips and stuff, but it's about rich oil tycoons in Texas. It's a melodrama where they try to make money. They have affairs. There's a million people in this show. I'll put the intro up from YouTube and you'll see how long this intro is. But anyway, it was a popular show. Lots of people were watching it around the world. But to simplify and summarize, one of the more interesting things was that Ang put out surveys, asked people to say why they like Dallas or why they watch Dallas, and the answers are what are important. And again, not the answers because of the show, but of what they reveal about how audiences in general watch TV in general, which can be applied to other things like Netflix and stuff like that today. So what she found was that people were hesitant to say that they were Dallas fans because people kind of understood that Dallas wasn't a great show. I mean, it was melodramatic, it had lots of little soap opera elements, and it had a bunch of people that weren't very good in general. They were just trying to make money, and by today's standards, they definitely were not good people, I think, in general. But people still wanted to see what was happening, and Who Shot JR became a big thing that you might have heard of, and The Simpsons even did a parody sort of that, and there are all these moments that people were interested in seeing. Kind of like today, if you think about your guilty pleasure, maybe you watch The Bachelor or Bachelorette, maybe you watch some reality TV show that is kind of dumb, but you also enjoy it because it lets you forget about school or work or whatever it is that might be on your mind. This lets you escape that. It's escapism, right? But you also know, as the people seem to have revealed in their Dallas questionnaires, that they are aware it's not a good thing. Not a good thing in that it's not that high culture lifting people up. It's not, Rupert gets frustrated too because he was a Dallas fan. It's not a show that you go to and you feel like you've accomplished something. In fact, maybe quite the opposite, and I'm sure you know what I mean. I'm sure you might have spent a little too much time binge watching something, and then afterwards you kind of think, where did my time go? Like, what was I doing? Sure, I was entertained, but I probably should have been exercising or reading or participating in the democratic process, doing big things that are important, that are high-level culture. Instead, this is popular culture in the shitty way, right? Like, this is lower level, easy to access, easy to understand. And so you know all that, and these people knew all that. And in fact, I think it's changed a lot where it's much more acceptable to say, yeah, I watch these garbage TV shows and you don't really feel judged. But I think in the 80s, people more so thought, I understand I should be doing better things with my time. However, I'm going to watch Dallas tonight. And so it's interesting, and you'll see in the excerpt that a lot of people said, I know it's not a good show, but, and then they sort of made excuses for it. And it's interesting because these excuses can be applied, like I said, to contemporary issues in popular culture more broadly. So why is it that we need to make excuses is part of what she was asking in the book. And she writes, and I quote, "A theory fulfills an ideological function if it fulfills an emotional function in people's heads. to which the assertion contained in the theory, the assertions are subordinated. And so what that means, my interpretation, is that, as we've said before with Roland Barthes, with Louis Althusser and others, ideology exists because it helps us understand a much more complicated world than we could understand otherwise. So there's all this stuff going on, you know it, I know it, but in order to function in the world, we kind of have to make shortcuts, and these shortcuts often end up doing bad things, right? Stereotyping people, stereotyping certain identities and groups, and so that's the bad side of it. The good side of it, of ideology, is that one, we're all in it, so we might as well better understand it, and two, it allows us to not go insane thinking about all the complexity of the world. Instead, we can say, good people do this, bad people do that, and that might not be the best way, but it's also one of the only ways that we can process what's going on around us, by just making shortcuts. Like, this is what we should do, this is what we shouldn't do. And when things get complicated, then we can reassess, but otherwise we tend to stick to these ideologies, right? So she has what she calls the ideology of bad objects. And so she's trying to identify why it is that people always say, look, I know, before they even say anything, they just say, I know Dallas isn't a good show, but they justify it some way, right? I'm critical, or I like to watch and make fun of them as we're doing it. And maybe you've done that again with some of the reality TV shows you watch. I'm sure you get together with friends, and I'm sure you make fun of the people. I'm sure you don't, it's not a one-to-one, like the show wants you to think it's super cool and you think it's super cool. And that's kind of how early cultural studies, it wasn't even cultural studies at that point, but early media studies thought about media. So the fear was that if you watch a TV show, you'll become like that person, or if you watch a film, you'll do those things you see in the film. And maybe that, to an extent, can happen, right? If you see boxers, maybe you want, or inspired, and you want to take up boxing or something. What doesn't happen, though, what we realize, and that should be apparent, I hope, to you, but it often isn't when you start to study media, because all the students want to say often at the beginning of a media class or pop culture class, this show made people do this. And that's often not how it works. Instead, people read it in different ways, right? So some people read Dallas, and I say read, but what I mean is they viewed it and interpreted it, right? So you can read everything. You can read my face, you can read books behind me, you can read audio, music, whatever. So anyway, people who read Dallas read it in contrasting ways. So some maybe business people in the US saw it as an ideal that they wanted to achieve as well. They wanted to get the kind of wealth and the kind of deals that they were seeing. Other people saw it, especially perhaps, in more communist or socialist countries, and said, look how evil and greedy Americans are. I hate these people, but I'm still watching the show, right? And so there's all these interpretations. Like, people can see racism in the show now, especially once you become more conscious of those themes, but also people can see it and see no racism whatsoever. And again, when we're talking about ideology, that's not a question of true or false. It's more of a question of how are we interpreting the myth, the second level of language underneath the show. And so what we see is a lot of people read Dallas, tuned into Dallas, and saw it in different ways. But they were conscious that they were doing something dumb, like they saw it as culturally dumb, sort of. I'm paraphrasing, it's not the words that Ang uses, but let's just say, right, you're watching this show that you know is dumb, or you believe is dumb, and culturally you're right. People around you all kind of have this agreement, and yet all these people are watching it. And so either you're the only smart person watching this show and you're conscious that it's dumb, but everybody else is just dumb, or everybody, and this I think is more likely, thinks that other people are dumb, but they're not. They're watching it and they're thinking critically about these characters or about the plot lines, while they know that other people watch it just because they're dumb. And this is this weird thing that we do with popular culture, right? We have these pleasures that we get from watching or reading or doing whatever, but we know that they're not high-level caliber, School of Athens, Greek philosophers, that kind of stuff, right? We're not struggling to comprehend most of this stuff. We're enjoying it instead. And so we know that it's a low-level thing in terms of, culture, but we also do it. So we always remove ourselves one step, or at least the people did who responded to these studies, right? They removed themselves and they said, look, it's a dumb thing and dumb people do this. I'm not a dumb person though, so I'm doing it, but I'm conscious of it. And again, pretty much everyone seemed to do that. And I'm sure, again, you do it too. So what I want to do is I've added some things to the site that I want you to check out, but I want you simply to think about and self-reflect on your own interpretation of popular culture and how it can be studied. So that's what this book from the 80s is all about today, is looking back on how we used to think about media as this thing that as soon as somebody sees this show, they're all going to do this, right? Instead, thinking, what are the different ways people view this and how do they interpret it? And it's much more based on audiences and their own uses and gratifications, their own decoding, and we'll get to these ideas soon as well, but the idea that you can decode things differently from different people. So you might get together with your friends and be like, man, these people are so dumb, can't believe they're doing this, what an idiot, what did he just say, I can't believe that, and yet, you're still watching it. So you're one of these dumb people watching it, but you're also not, because you're taking a step back. And most of pop culture, I think, and most of culture in general today, our mediated, saturated thing that we call culture, whatever that is, does that. It works in that way. So there's this ideology that these are bad things. American TV in general is just, a bad object. It's bad because it doesn't help us. It doesn't help us grow. It doesn't lift up our spirits or intellectual development. And yet we all kind of take part in this mass culture. And so that is what she calls the ideology of mass culture, and this idea of bad objects. We like them, but we don't want to say, hey, I'm dumb and I like this. So instead we make up sort of stories about how we critically interpret, and again, you might not say this to your friends, but you might say, The Bachelor's dumb, but I'm going to watch it again because I enjoy laughing at what they say or mocking the characters, or I'm more interested in how they portray romance today, and that's what I'm looking into while I watch this, right? That's it in a nutshell. And so I don't want to take up too much time because there's lots to think about, and I know it's challenging. I also want you to think about how it is that people choose different television shows. And it's interesting because you probably think that you like television show A and you don't like television show B. But what we find when we study these things in a large way, in a big scale, top-down way, we see that actually you and a lot of people in your demographic, maybe your age, maybe your location, maybe your intellectual development, if you're in graduate studies or if you're a high school student or what have you, all of these push people to like certain things in different ways. And it's actually interesting that you can find, or you can make a reasonable guess. You can make a fairly accurate guess at how people will be voting based on the TV shows they like, even if they have nothing to do with the TV shows politically. And you can make an accurate guess or a semi-accurate guess what their other ideological beliefs are, right? So you're more likely to watch Clint Eastwood if you feel a certain way about what Americanness means, right? Than you are to watch, let's say, Atlanta. That's a different sort of group of people, even though you don't get together and say, I'm a Clint Eastwood kind of guy, and no, I'm a Danny Glover kind of guy. You still have these interpretive communities, we can call them, who get together, even if they don't physically or even mentally get together, but they fit a certain group, and they often see things in diverse ways as opposed to one way. But they also tend to group themselves, right? So you watch a sophisticated show and you say, hey, I'm sophisticated, I watch this show, and somebody else says, I watch that show too. We must all be sophisticated, right? Other people might watch a show and think completely different thoughts, but they have similar ideologies and why it is that they're getting something out of this, and why the other people who don't like this show are dumb in a different kind of way, right? It gets very complicated, but on a basic level, Ang's study helps us think about ideology and popular culture and media. And that's what we're going to use it for, to think about. And I want you, in this week's activity, to think about how you might take what you read from that study, from that excerpt, and do it again in a new way. So, like I said, she's doing it in the 80s, and with a show called Dallas. I doubt very much that you would send out, physical surveys, and I doubt very much you would apply it to Dallas. But what might you find if you applied it to a new show, and what would you expect to change in terms of the way that this study was conducted if you were to do it today, looking for similar ideas? And what do you think wouldn't change? What are the sort of ideological factors that, even though they get applied to different things, remain fairly consistent, or at least you would assume so if you were to do this study. It's a little different because you're being asked to think about what would happen if you were to do this study. Obviously, if you want to be an academic, you should actually go and do these studies before you make any claims, but this is just a mental exercise this week. So you don't have to do a study, but I want you to think about how you would do a similar study to watching Dallas today. You might want to start thinking also about maybe films or TV shows that you can study for your final essay, your final small essay. Your final small essay will be on film, and I'll do a separate video on that. But as you're reading this, as you're thinking about it, I encourage you, like I said at the very beginning of this class, right? What are the more beautiful passages? What are the more difficult passages? And also, how might this be applied to something else? And that's the key this week, I would say, is maybe you'll see this and you'll think, oh, that show I was just watching, or that film that just got released, I see a lot of parallels here, even though it's obviously quite different content. Maybe you want to write about that for your short essay on film, or it can be television as well. Anyway, lots to think about. I hope your week is going well. I hope you're staying safe, and I will talk to you soon.